Wes Huff, though he was clearly well informed, highly educated, well studied, he maintained such a humble and gracious posture.
Buongiorno. You're listening to Going, Where God is at Work, a podcast that sits at the intersection of missions theory and practice. We're walking out our call to ministry in faraway places and happy to have you join us on the journey. I'm your host, Pauly, a missions leader serving in Rome, and I'm here with Alessandro Di Leonardo, church planner in Cisterna di Latina, and Jenn Williamson, our missiologist who lives and works in Lyon. Good morning, guys.
Good morning, Jesse. Good morning, Jen.
Good morning, guys.
How's everybody doing? Is it cold? I feel like here it's gotten colder the last couple of days.
I thought it was the opposite.
Did you?
It's raining in Cisterna, but it's definitely not as cold. It was cold maybe a week ago.
And I'm just feeling really cold sitting here in the office, especially like I have the heat turned off so it's not making noise behind the microphone and stuff. And it's just, it's getting cold. Anyways, digress. So we're going to take a pause today. I don't know if you guys, meaning you listeners, because obviously these guys know since we're going to talk about it, but there has been a bit of a viral kind of situation going on YouTube, and mostly on YouTube, but in general on social media, with Joe Rogan recently invited Wesley Huff on his podcast. And so we're going to get into a little bit of what happened. For many of you might have heard of Joe Rogan. He's done so many different things, host of Fear Factor. He has the #1 podcast in the world. He's often involved in like UFC and different martial arts events. Uses a lot of colorful language. Recently, they've even said like a lot of Donald Trump winning the election could be attributed to the fact that he appeared on Joe Rogan's podcast and like got over 54 million views by having a 3-hour long conversation with Joe Rogan in his house. But he invited Wesley Huff, who is a biblical scholar and the first probably true Christian biblical scholar that he's ever had on the podcast. So, Jen, do you want to help kind of set the scene a little bit of how we got to that point?
Yeah, so it was an interesting chain of events where Christian apologist Wesley Huff was originally invited onto the Elevating Beyond podcast with host Mark Menard on October 18th. And he was invited to debate Billy Carson about Christianity in the Bible. So Mark Menard's a Christian, although his podcast is essentially about overcoming adversity and achieving success. He is, perhaps I should say was, a personal friend of Billy Carson. And Billy Carson is a social media influencer who's passionate about spirituality and history and produces videos and events and authors books that aim to debunk a lot of historical Christian teachings. So Billy Carson claims things like Jesus was never crucified or that maybe he was married, things like that. So both Wes Huff and Billy Carson had only 24 hours notice before they met up on the Elevating Beyond podcast to record. And so really they had to just come with what they knew. They couldn't do a whole bunch of studying up on the other person or read up a ton on their perspectives. Now, I wasn't familiar with either of these people before last week.
You're welcome.
Any of those three. So Wes Huff very patiently and respectfully refuted all of the claims that Billy Carson brought, demonstrating really an incredible familiarity with and understanding of the issues and the sources on which Carson was basing his arguments. So to put it simply, Huff clearly won the debate, if only from a humanistic point of view. He had greater knowledge of history and was clear on the more studied parts of how do we evaluate historical events. He's a linguist. He knew the ancient languages. And the end result was a very angry Carson who asked for the video to be taken down. It was Carson's own strong and public visceral reaction to the debate that actually put it on Joe Rogan's radar. So he pretty much shot himself in the foot by making a big stink about it. So this got Joe Rogan curious, and he started looking up and listening to Wesley Huff's stuff, who has a bunch of stuff out there also on on YouTube and his own social media presence. Now, this most popular podcaster in the world, Joe Rogan, ends up inviting a Christian apologist to his show that just had Trump on a few weeks before, right? And he had a 3-hour conversation with Wesley Huff. And in that conversation, Joe Rogan is genuinely impressed with Wes Huff and curious about not only his experience in debating Billy Carson, but in his understanding of the historicity of Christianity. So having listened to both of those podcasts, and we can link them in the show notes, I was also really impressed with Wes Huff's expertise, his ability to articulate what he knew, and the winsomeness with which he communicated. He was respectful. He was patient. Everything that Billy Carson brought up, I had studied in seminary, so none of it was actually surprising to me. But I do wonder if it would be surprising to believers who had not had theological training. And maybe even some of that stuff could have been destabilizing to their faith if they hadn't studied it before or heard of it before, like alternative gospels and things like that. Nevertheless, Wes Huff had such grace-filled but theologically solid responses, which is the gift, I think, that historians, apologists, and linguists bring to the world.
Yeah, this whole scenario has been really interesting. I brought it up to the guys and said, hey, I think we should react to this, because also I actually don't watch a lot of the Joe Rogan podcast or listen to a lot of the Joe Rogan podcast. I could probably count on one hand the amount of times I've listened to it. But some of the other podcasts in YouTube, YouTube influencers that I do follow, do listen a lot. And they've been talking for months, maybe even years, about the journey Joe Rogan has been on of just saying things very anti-Christianity a few years back to then slowly making moves where he's been having more and more conversations with people who are also exploring Christianity, like Jordan Peterson and others, and just seeing, on this on public display this journey really that he's been on. And so then it kind of felt like it was culminating in, wow, now he's actually having finally someone who really can represent the Bible well. And so it just kind of, it was interesting to think. We were talking last year about the Lausanne movement, and one of the responses they were having was, the need for us as Christians to think of how do we leverage digital media, for the proclamation of the gospel and for sharing it. And so kind of drove the question, like, was this that? What kind of opportunity was there for Wes as an apologist, as a biblical scholar to share? And so it got me thinking on, like, okay, what is the role of the apologist? Is it different from an evangelist or a missionary? Should Huff have should he have said something differently? There's a lot of debate going on. Christian influencers are talking about, was it a gospel presentation or was it not a gospel presentation? So yeah, wanted to pose the question to you guys. I think both of you had a chance now to listen at least to the Joe Rogan interview and conversation with Wes Huff. What do you think? Did he blow his chance? Was he able to make a clear gospel presentation?
Yeah, those are good questions. And I'm sure a lot of people are asking or are already answering those questions. I think just from my experience, it's good to define some of the terms. We have done an episode on what it is an evangelist, and we might have referenced an apologist. But just so in case people don't know what an apologist is, it's someone who offers an argument in defense of something usually controversial. So a Christian apologist would then be someone who defends the Christian faith. This is what Wes Huff does actually on his social media. He's not a pastor, and he said it often, and he's actually a historian and a linguist who studies historical documents and evidence. And then he shares how he shares what he finds and that it aligns with traditional Christian teachings. And so that's sort of what his ministry is all about.
Yeah. So what do you think? Like, what was your take, Alessandro, from that, definition, that perspective of kind of who he is? Do you feel like he made a gospel presentation, or?
So I'll say this. He's not a pastor. I am. And I have been accused, and I'm not the only one, to have not preached the gospel on a Sunday. So just letting you know that it's always there. And sometimes it's true, right? Sometimes we might miss the mark. And thank God for God's grace, and thank God that it's not up to me. And we do have a responsibility, and there are times that we might miss the mark. So just wanted to put that disclaimer that, and then there's sometimes that I know I have preached the gospel, and then people just have their own little box of what a gospel is. And they're like, yeah, are you going to be preaching the gospel next Sunday? So just putting it out there. So having listened to Wes Huff specifically with the Joe Rogan podcast, I think he laid out what needed to be laid out. I don't think he had the platform, the opportunity to be like, let me tell you what the gospel is. So he had to work, and I thought it was really smart. He had to work with what was being presented. And I thought that he did an excellent job presenting all the pieces. And then ultimately we have to ask, who was he presenting the gospel to? Was he presenting the gospel to Joe Rogan or to everyone who's listening in? That's a huge audience. As a pastor, when we're preaching, as if you study the gospels, you notice that the gospel is presented, there's only one gospel, but the gospel is presented in many ways. And so why do you present the gospel in many ways? Because depending on the audience, now you're talking about, okay, there's a physical person in front of you asking the questions, but then there's also a huge viewing out there. So it's tricky. So I think Wes did an excellent job giving the essentials to then piece it together. And then if people come to Christ through that, that's awesome. But I do think that then people can pick up from that, and hopefully they have a Christian friend, or hopefully they are attending a church, or hopefully whatever God's means would be used to pick up from there, and then fill in the gaps if there was any gaps missing.
Yeah, I have to say, from my perspective, like I also was thinking, I don't know if I'm necessarily an evangelist or just the missionary in me, but I was thinking like, okay, I was waiting for like, okay, when's the moment where he's gonna like pin him and say, okay, now make a decision. I had that a little bit in the back of my mind as I was listening, but there was a certain point where I started realizing like, no, Joe is actually asking genuine questions. Like you could see he was genuinely curious to the answers, and he was actually quite surprised. You could see like he hadn't heard those answers so clearly laid out. And so that made me kind of like, I actually found myself being less on edge, waiting for the gospel gotcha moment type of thing, and more for the, oh, I'm actually learning, some things from what he was sharing. Because I mean, yeah, he's an expert in his field. Who can't learn more on biblical, on textual criticism and the legitimacy of the Bible from an expert, no matter who you are? I think one of the things that I thought, we've talked on this podcast in season 1 about the angle scale, and how as we evangelize, we're moving, people are moving kind of along the angle scale, and we might come into that journey at different points, on the angle scale. And I thought it was really interesting in light of what I was saying earlier, where Wes Huff came in now on this podcast, because he was able to, after answering a lot of the skepticism that Joe Rogan said, 2 hours into the conversation, he's able to then turn a little bit and ask a question to Rogan, basically saying, who do you say Jesus is essentially what he says. And I thought that was, in my opinion, that was a big win. You have to go listen to the podcast to know how Rogan responds and so forth. But I just thought that was a big win, because it kind of moved the needle a little bit. Okay, now you've been on this journey, you've been asking different questions, you've been exploring different things. So after all of that, who do you say Jesus is? And so for me, even if nothing else happened after that, just the fact that he had an opportunity to defend, with Apologetics, why the Bible is worthy to be trusted, and then to say, okay, now that I've defended basically why it's worthy to be trusted, who do you say Jesus is? I thought that alone would be a great way of seeding and posing questions to Rogan. And to your point, all the millions of people that have now, I think it's over 4 million people have seen that podcast on YouTube alone.
Yeah. I think what Wes Huff did is really important. And I think when people have, like, I love how you said that, Alessandro, like they have some sort of tiny box that to them is the presentation of the gospel. They're missing the possibility that people are asking different questions, and maybe they're not even ready to hear that gospel yet, because they don't know if they can trust if the Bible is valid as a historical document. So going then to where Jesse's saying, it really depends where people are on the journey what questions they have and what needs to be answered. But ever since the Enlightenment, we live in a world, especially in the West, where rationale is king. And if people don't think that a source is believable or trustworthy, or they, especially for a religion that makes outlandish claims, we believe that God became a human, that God rose from the dead. We believe things that challenge our rational minds. And so what are those beliefs based in? And so I think that the apologetics piece is really important. I think it's important for believers. We're told as believers to always be prepared to give an answer for the reason for our faith. And so it's good for us, as you both have said, to understand and to know how trustworthy, in fact, the Bible is as a historical document, how it actually passes all of the tests needed to validate historicity. I think that's important. But I also think that apologetics speaks more to the mind, whereas evangelism speaks more to the heart, and does get to that question where Jesus finally says, "Who do you say that I am?" That question that Wes asked Joe Rogan, "Who do you say that Jesus is?" That's a different question. I could read a whole bunch of books about Abraham Lincoln, and I could tell you all sorts of things about Abraham Lincoln, and I could tell you historically what Abraham Lincoln did. But I've never met Abraham Lincoln. I couldn't say I've had a conversation with him. Evangelism is the piece that starts to put us into conversation, into relationship with the person of God. It's not about just knowing about God or about what the Bible says about God. It's about realizing I can know God. I can talk to God. I can have a conversation with God. And I think that actually the venue, the media being used here was much more suited to apologetics. Because again, when we get to evangelism, there's a relational component. What is the need of the person before me? What are they experiencing? Where do they need to know God? What part of the faith journey are they on? And what is the next step for them? That's a really personal, independent. It's a thing that is done in my context where I am today, given my situation, given my background. Or apologetics is more like, this is true for everyone all the time. So I think Wes Huff did what was exactly appropriate for the media that he was on.
Yeah, and I think that's a key thing to point out. Like, if we're going to use digital media to spread the gospel, to share biblical truths, we do also need to take into account the idea that the different digital media platforms that are out there also have different use cases, are also being used for different things. So like the podcast setting is a long form content, like 3 hours of discussing. You can put on a front for a long time, but after, a couple hours of sitting and talking with someone, the guards start to go down a little bit. You start to have more of a conversation that's much more real and a lot less scripted, which is, I think, what was interesting about this and others on Rogan's podcast, where they talk so long. And so at some point you kind of start to notice, okay, this person's kind of off of his talking points and just actually speaking from the heart, the mind. And so I think, to your point, Jenn, the apologetics, that gave room for them to flush out and to chase little rabbit holes and to talk through different things. If you're doing, a YouTube short or a Instagram reel or something, and those are just like 30 seconds that someone's going to look at them, you might be a little bit different, a little bit more direct. And you just have to adjust how you're doing it for the context that you're in, and even the depth, the depth of the relationship you have with the person. Like in an interview perspective, you might really know that person, or you might not know them at all, like in this case. And then there's like the whole thing of like the guy that goes up to strangers and it's like, I'm never going to see you again, so I have one chance to tell you, and so I'm going to try and make sure I give you a clear gospel presentation because I'm never going to see you again. So different strokes for different folks, I guess, is the point. That being said, could we spend a little bit of time just thinking about how do we use these tools? Like, I just shared a few different digital media things and some aspects of them, but how do we use these tools that we have for furthering the gospel?
Well, in one way, I mean, if we're just going to more specifically focus about apologetics, which goes in line with evangelism, if you pick up an apologetics book, it starts off with the question and then the answer. So now really what you're doing is you can turn a book into a channel where people are now asking the question and then answering it. In fact, you just introduced me to one, Jesse, an Italian apologetic evangelism online. And that's exactly what to do. There is no one they invite. There is no anyone asking the questions. They propose it and then they answer it. And it's questions that they have thought about that most likely everybody else is asking. And so that's one way of going about it, is just simply being able to put out answers there because people are asking them. That's one way I've seen it being used.
Yeah, for sure. I think for me, I think the idea too of like using, I personally like the style of what Rogan and Wes had, like that long form conversation style. I know some people, we talk a lot about, people's attention span is only 30 minutes or 25 minutes and 26 seconds or whatever. Like we're always hearing these things, and pastors are always trying to get their sermons down to certain lengths and stuff based off of what the latest stats are. But I think personally, what I find is that idea of like, when you just let someone talk and you let it go as long as it needs to go, you start to actually get real conversation happening. And you kind of get out of the kind of small talk. Everyone's on there minding their P's and Q's, and you start moving into actually, okay, this is what the heart is saying. This is what's actually going on. And then you actually, I feel like, can really start to address the needed things and not so much the surfacey kind of defense mechanism. That's also what I appreciated about the idea of the conversation, because they called it a debate with Billy Carson, but really, like I've watched other debates. Usually a debate is moderated. There's kind of, a high level of defense and preparation. That was more of like a conversation almost. It wasn't really a debate. And in some ways, I think that was better probably, because we don't want to just be right that the gospel is true and just be right that the Bible is true. Like, we want others to really, like, we want to be right for them. We want them to actually receive what we have to share and what we have to say. And so sometimes I feel like the debate mode can put someone in a defensive posture, and it just kind of becomes automatically kind of, now I'm just going to refute and what you have to say, and kind of a battle back and forth. Whereas these long form conversations are less of that. And so I find that to be really helpful. And I like watching those types of conversations.
I think what impressed me the most and what my biggest takeaway was, doctors are trained when they go into medicine. First, do no harm. In other words, don't make the problem worse. And so often I think, and Wes Huff, though he was clearly well informed, highly educated, well studied, he maintained such a humble and gracious posture interacting with Billy Carson. And I think, to me, that speaks volumes, because if all of Christianity is truth with a capital T, but it doesn't change how I treat my neighbor, how I interact with the people around me, how I engage the world, then what's the real value? If Christ doesn't actually change us, it doesn't matter how right we are. So I was really impressed that, to me, that was a huge part of what I would call his testimony. He did share some pieces of his personal testimony, especially with Joe Rogan. But to me, the bigger testimony was how he was, Joe Rogan is dropping the F-bomb and Wes Huff is kind and gracious. He never speaks with the same language, but he's not condemning and condescending. With Billy Carson, you could see Billy getting defensive and a little edgy, and Wes would actually kind of take a step back and give space and then say, well, here's what I know to be true as a historian, or here's what I understand about the linguistics. And so, yeah, to me, I think we have to think about, in every media context, is this not just what I want to say, but is this how I want to say it? And is this the place I want to say it? Would this be better in a direct message? Would this be better actually taken offline and in a human conversation? Is this really the place? Because honestly, I don't think we change people's minds with a Twitter X post or a tweet or a Instagram. Like, I don't know that we might be preaching to the choir and kind of helping form our tribe and virtue signaling about who we're with, but I'm not sure we're actually winning hearts. So I think, thinking through, is this the place? Is this the way? And I think, for the place that Wes Huff was invited and where he was interacting, the way he did it spoke volumes to me.
What do you think we can learn as the church? Like, what do you think we can learn as the body of believers from this whole kind of situation, the whole scenario of how Wes Huff had this opportunity?
I think, in regards to the opportunity, I think he didn't even know he was going to have the opportunity. So just kind of rejoice of opportunities that God brings forward. I think one of the things I'm reminded being here in the mission field was what my friend kept saying, just be faithful. And that's what he is. That's what he's doing. He's being faithful. And then God sometimes opens up what we quote unquote say bigger opportunities, but really any opportunity to share the gospel is an awesome opportunity. Any opportunity to defend the faith is a great opportunity. So from that aspect, opportunity wise, that's what I would say. But also from those conversations, I think something to take from is realizing that you don't have to have all the answers. And I think someone as well-versed and studied, Wes at times made it clear, oh no, I'm not an archaeologist. I do have friends who are, but I'm not. And so I think even myself as a pastor, I have to remember, like, I don't have to be like all this person who has all the answers. Like, I really don't know much about that. Let me look into it, or let me see how I can help you with this, or let's look at it together. We don't have to have all the answers. And so I think that was a great encouragement to see even someone like Wes to be able to step back and say, hey, I know my lane. I'm going to stick to this lane. And we should all as well.
Yeah, I loved that too. I loved his ability to say, where he wasn't able to speak. And that's good encouragement to us. I was reminded of the importance of using my own discernment in the voices that I'm listening to, because pretty much anybody can put themselves out there today as an expert in many, many categories. And many people do. And they can sound like they know what they're talking about, and they've come across some piece of information that they think enlightens the world or debunks the myths or whatever. And a lot of times those people are they found one thing, they were intrigued by it, and they make, a big pronouncement about it. And experts are studied not just on a single topic, but in the breadth of research around that topic. So I want to be careful who I'm listening to. I want to be careful that I'm also checking, double checking, studying sources, being aware of, where'd they get that? Is that true? Can I trust it? I think those are good questions to be asking. It also encouraged me to know what I can know. I can't answer everyone's questions. I'm not going to be Wes Huff in terms of understanding history and linguistics and all of the things that he knows. But I should be able to respond to someone's general objections or concerns about the truth of Christianity. I want to know enough to be able to walk alongside someone who is genuinely searching and interested. So I think it's helpful to know some, for example, trustworthy apologists like this that we can learn from, study up on, understand. It also helps us stay stable in our own faith when things come in that challenge what we believe and why we believe it.
Yeah, I would say for me, that was probably one of the big things. There was just moments where, I was just taking in what he was explaining, and I was like, man, that helped me. Like, that helped me just be like, okay, I knew this was true, and now I even heard it explained in a different way. Because also that changes too. When you go to Bible school or seminary and stuff, things are being explained typically by Christians to Christians, and so you use a certain language, you use certain terminology, and all these kind of things. But sometimes when you hear it explained to someone who's not a Christian, you're choosing words, you're choosing ways of explaining that are different, that you're hoping will connect more with that person. And for me, hearing him explain things to Joe Rogan just helped solidify things that I had already been known a little and heard of, and even got to use, because just recently I was in a conversation with someone and they were talking about, yeah, but the Bible is translated all these different languages, and and they use the whole example of the telephone game, and like when you talk to this person and that person says the next person, and it loses it over time, and I was like, to hear him kind of rebuttal that and explain, like, no, actually these translations go back to the earliest source and translate from the earliest source, so they're way more reliable than the telephone game. And yes, there are translations that don't do that, and those aren't as reliable. I thought, wow, that was super helpful. And then when I got to explain that to the person that I had recently been talking about, you could just see that she was also like, oh, okay, that's a better explanation. That makes more sense to why these are more reliable. Or even just the idea of like the whole idea of the book of Isaiah, and the fact that the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found years later shown that it was still the same, like there hadn't been changes made. And so I just found little nuggets like that are helpful in little conversations. Like we said, it's a different thing when you're appealing to someone's mind versus when you're getting to the heart of the issues. And sometimes you do have to have those rational kind of cerebral conversations before someone's willing to actually open up about what's actually the deeper side of things. And one of the things I thought was really cool is, in a way, this was also cross-cultural. I mean, Wes Huff was someone who grew up overseas, and then he's Canadian, he's talking to Americans. Like, it was just interesting to see kind of that dynamic too, because I've learned, I used to think like, oh, Canadians, they're just like Americans, but it's colder up there or something. And the more that I've gotten to know Canadians and spent time with Canadians, I am learning, like, yeah, it's a different culture. We aren't the same, even though a lot of times people lump North Americans all in as being the same. And so I thought it was cool too, just to see his way of handling that conversation, even culturally. It was way more winsome, way more gracious than I think others might have been, which is probably why some of the American audience is currently making all their little YouTube and blog posts saying that Wes Huff wasn't aggressive enough or didn't do things how they would have wanted. But I thought, it was really cool to see even that element, that he was still himself. And he has a podcast as well with a couple friends, and they do talk about apologetics. So we can try and link all these different things so people can go ahead and see those. Any final thoughts or anything anyone wants to interject before we wrap up?
I would say sometimes these great tools out there, like these videos and even books out there, sometimes they're meant to be more digested from people who have the opportunity then to speak to the crowd. And so in my case, being a pastor, I watch this. I don't think I'd be like, hey, you should watch this debate if I have the similar questions. But I could, like you just said, Jesse, you could digest it and then use it. And I think that's one way we can really understand how these can be used, these tools. I think it's so great. I've studied these things also in seminary, but I couldn't recall them like Wes. So to have a refresher and even be able to put it out the way he did, I'm like, oh yeah, that's a good way to do so. And then the last thing I would want to say is that what is wrong. So yeah, someone's always going to criticize. There's always, unfortunately, this is the kind of world we live in. I think when I've seen something that needs to be criticized is when someone actually gives the wrong answer because of fear of stepping on the wrong toes. And so I think that's the issue, when some people will say, well, Jesus never talked about this, so I don't either. It's kind of that sort of like cop out. I think that's the problem. I think that's something we can say, yeah, that was wrong. And we didn't, at least I didn't catch any of that from Wes. And so that's something definitely to think about. What is not wrong, at least I've often used that, is that when someone does have a question, you have to, and Jesus really did that, you have to kind of ask yourself, are they really asking that question, or is that sort of like a shield? And sometimes the way to deflect the shield is to answer it, or sometimes it's to actually put it aside and hold it there, hold that tension, and talk about something else. I remember these teenagers were asking me, or one particular were like, oh, I can't believe the Bible, especially with like a talking snake. And I said, yeah, that does sound unbelievable. But what about the other stuff? What do you think about that? The fact that, we're sinners and stuff. So I didn't answer about a talking snake. I just laid it aside. It's okay. We don't have to talk about the talking snake. Let's talk about the sin aspect. you feel like you sin. And so sometimes even that we don't have to have all the answers. If we do, we don't have to come out, as Jenn said, blazing with guns to say, I got that.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting. I think we should also encourage the listeners to be praying for Wes and his team, because when you get this kind of notoriety and this kind of publicity, I mean, he's already made a video saying, look, I'm not going to come on every podcast invitation and every debate invitation, because apparently he's receiving hundreds of requests now for debates and stuff. And, you know, he's a young guy. He's 33, I believe he said, and has a family. And so, I mean, we want to pray for him too, that this isn't something that goes to his head too much, or that he is able to steward well and the people around him are able to encourage and help him in that. Yeah, I know he got invited to another big podcast immediately after I forget the name of it, Valuetainment podcast or whatever. And so, I mean, he's starting to get a lot of invitations, and just pray that he continues to be humble, continues to stick to what he does, and that God would protect him along the way. But yeah, this was fun. It was fun little break from our mini series that we've been doing, and we look forward to getting back into those next time. Hey, thanks for tuning in to today's episode. We hope you enjoyed the conversation and found it insightful. Your ministry is important, and we hope that you consider your time spent with us as an investment in your work. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this podcast with your friends. And until next time, keep going wherever Jesus leads.